y'all, Dixie here. Now let's talk about sleep systems. Are you going to go with a traditional mummy bag sleeping bag, or are you interested in backpacking quilts? Backpacking sleeping bags and quilts are pretty similar, but a quilt is designed to offer more versatility and they're usually more lightweight. Quilts have a strap system that go around your sleeping pad, so that's how you kind of cinch them down at the sides and protect yourself from any drafts. But the idea of the quilt is to eliminate extra weight and material that you really aren't getting use out of anyway, because when you're in a sleeping bag and you're lying on your back or even your stomach, that material and insulation under you is getting compressed and is probably not offering you much warmth anyway. Also, a quilt, as I've learned, is very convenient for those who toss and turn while they sleep. Because if you're in a sleeping bag, you've got to pay attention to where your zipper is. That's the place where heat will escape, so you've got to try to keep that zipper under you. And if you're like me, like a little worm flipping and flopping, then having to shimmy that zipper to the position under me every time I get cold just keeps me up a lot at night. But with the quilt being strapped to the sleeping pad, you're able to spin around and the quilt stays put. I used a sleeping bag on the AT because honestly, I had never even heard about quilts, and I probably would have been too timid to try one just because, like I mentioned before, there was so much that was already new. But after several years of using sleeping bags, I finally got brave and tried a quilt, and I haven't looked back. It's definitely a personal preference, and you won't be wrong whatever you choose. When selecting a sleeping bag or a quilt, the things that I prioritize are having something that's lightweight, compact, and warm enough to keep me comfortable when it's really cold out. Fill material, or the stuff that is used as insulation in your sleeping bag or quilt, will definitely affect how compressible it is, how lightweight it is, and the price. Your two options are down or synthetic. Down is much more lightweight and compressible than synthetics are, but down doesn't retain its insulating abilities like synthetics when it's wet. And I realize nobody aims to sleep in a wet or really damp sleeping bag, but things happen, like tents leak or they could not be set up properly, and then you've got a pool of water in your tent, and you wake up and your down sleeping bag has pretty much melted before your eyes. A lot of companies will treat their down to help it repel water though, so this at least helps with the situations of having your sleeping bag brush against the wall of your tent that's collected a lot of condensation. When I was on the AT, the sleeping bag I took with me had the dry down version of this, and I think it definitely helped in those light dampening situations. But we pack our fears, and if you're somebody who is afraid of having a down sleeping bag in cold and possibly wet weather, then maybe synthetic is the way to go for you, just for your peace of mind. Synthetic is definitely more budget friendly. It's going to be cheaper than most of your down options for sleeping bags and quilts. Something else to consider with down versus synthetic is if you're grossed out by your own BO, then you should know that washing down takes a little bit more effort than a synthetic sleeping bag. Down bags need special down detergent. Some of them require hanging out to dry. Some of them you can tumble on low, but you'll need a front-loading washer, etc. But with a synthetic sleeping bag, things are just much simpler. So if you know for sure that it's a deal breaker for you to not be able to wash your sleeping bag while you're out there, synthetic's probably the way to go. I didn't worry about washing mine, I just embraced the stink. Something that you could do, I guess, as a middle of the way option here. For a while I carried a very thin silk liner, like the most lightweight but yet cheap liner that I could find, and I would use that to sleep in my sleeping bag with. I'm sure it added a tiny bit more warmth to it, but probably nothing notable. And then when I got to town, I would pull my liner out and wash that, so at least something was getting freshened up a little bit. But part of the way along the trail, I decided I really wanted to ditch those 3 or 4 ounces, whatever the liner was, and I mailed it home and just dealt with my sleeping bag being gross. I've been using down for years, and it's just what I prefer. I think it's cozy, and definitely the weight savings and space savings in my pack make me prefer down. But unfortunately, I found out recently that I am allergic to down, so I've switched to synthetic. But if it hadn't been for that allergy, I would have never switched. When I was planning my AT hike, something that I was really stressed out about was what temperature rating to get for my sleeping bag. To start off with, it was pretty cold, and when I got to Maine at the end, it was pretty cold. I went with a temperature rating of 23 degrees. Unfortunately, what I didn't pay attention to was that meant I would survive at 23 degrees. There's a big difference in survival rating temperatures for sleeping bags and comfort rating temperatures. So I did live, but there were some nights at the beginning and at the end that I was pretty chilly. So when deciding what temperature rating you need for yourself, I would think, first of all, what temperatures are you expecting to see? Are you going to start in that same time frame, or will you start potentially earlier, like in February, where you might have colder temperatures? Or if you're starting in Maine and coming down to Georgia, will you be in Georgia in November and December when it possibly is colder than 20 degrees at night? And then two, how cold-natured are you as a human being? I'm always cold. It can be in the summertime and I go eat at a restaurant and it's too cold in the restaurant for me and I want to go back outside in the summer heat. So in the back of your mind, if you're thinking, hey, I'm worried about being too hot at night, then that's an indication that you're probably not a cold sleeper. If you're worried about being too cold, then you might want to err on the side of safety and get one that's rated a little bit lower than what you think you will need for comfort, not for survival. I didn't know what all of this stuff meant when I was first picking out my gear for the AT, but something else that you might notice when picking out a sleeping bag, or even if you were to order from a company like Enlightened Equipment and you got a custom bag or quilt, they ask you to select this. And that is denier of the material on the outside and the inside of your quilt. Denier just has to do with the thickness of a fiber in a fabric. For example, silk is said to be 1 denier. So as the number gets bigger, that means the thicker the fibers in the fabric and likely more durable the fabric is. But with thicker fibers, you're gonna have a heavier fabric. So if you're wondering kind of what the rule of thumb is, for myself on a thru hike, because I don't want any issues, I wouldn't feel comfortable going below a 10 denier fabric on the outside and the inside. 20D is sure going to be more durable, but then you're giving up a little bit more of your breathability. So to me, 10D is a happy middle, and that's what I go for. Another option you may see when selecting a sleeping bag or a quilt, if you're going to go with down insulation, is fill power. Fill power is just the volume in cubic inches that an ounce of down will fluff up and fill up. So fill power can definitely affect the weight of your sleeping bag or quilt, because if you're using less down to get the same volume of fluff, then you're going to have less weight in the sleeping bag. And higher quality down lofts up better after compression, so it helps to trap your body heat and keep you warmer. If you're worried about having a sleeping bag that has a temperature rating too low for the summertime and you're like, well, Dixie, what am I going to do when it's boiling hot at night and I don't want to sleep under this 20-degree bag? What a lot of hikers do is they will have 2 sleeping bags, one cold-rated sleeping bag, and then when they get to Damascus, Virginia for trail days in mid-May, they'll get the warmer rated bag, use it for the summer months, and then when it starts getting cold out again, they'll switch out up north somewhere. I couldn't afford 2 sleeping bags, or at least I wanted to allot that money towards lodging and food on the trail. So I just held on to my sleeping bag until Waynesboro, Virginia, when I was sure that it was warm enough at night that I would be okay without my sleeping bag. And I found for, I think, $20 or $30 at an outfitter a fleece sleeping bag liner that zipped up, so it still felt like a little cocoon, but it was more lightweight than my sleeping bag and it took up less space. And it was much cooler at night, and I could unzip it and use it just as a blanket or zip it up if I was a little bit chilly. I know some people ditch their sleeping bags and use things like a cheap fleece blanket from Walmart. You can get them for like $3 to $5. So there are options if you don't want to purchase 2 sleeping bags and you're not wanting to hold on to the one that you used in the colder months and sweat to death in your tent at night. When I was getting ready to start the AT, I noticed that a sleeping pad was in the list of suggested gear on different blogs that I had read. And I didn't really understand why, because I had never used a sleeping pad camping before. But there is a really big difference in going to the woods for the weekend and going out there for 6 months. Not only do sleeping pads add comfort, but they also help insulate you from the ground, keeping you warmer at night. There are 2 main types of sleeping pads that you'll see. Sometimes there can be a combination of the 2, but the 2 that you're most likely to see are closed cell foam pads and inflatable pads. Closed cell foam pads are pretty much indestructible, which makes them great for not only sleeping at night, but also for adding a little bit of cushion between you and a log, or throwing down on the trail when you want to take a break for lunch or take a nap on the trail. They are a little bulky, so you'll see most people attaching them to the outside of their pack just because they take up too much room on the inside. But even though they're bulky, they're more on the lightweight side of things when it comes to sleeping pads. Also, you can trim them down for the exact length that you need just by cutting them with some scissors. And therefore, you can make them even more lightweight. Closed cell foam pads are definitely cheaper than inflatable pads, but I would argue 100% that they are not near as comfortable as inflatable sleeping pads. Now, if you're somebody who can sleep on your back the whole night long and you never flip to your side or your stomach, then you may do just fine with a closed cell foam pad. Inflatable sleeping pads range wildly in price. You can find budget options for less than $50 and much higher end versions for $200+ plus. Just keep in mind that typically the cheaper inflatable sleeping pads end up being heavier than the closed cell foam pads. Some people will tell you that with an inflatable sleeping pad you have to take more care when setting up camp, and this is true in a way because you don't want to set up on some brush you didn't notice or thorns that can pop a hole in your sleeping pad. But when you have a closed cell foam pad, you're watching out for other stuff when setting up, maybe a root or a rock that's going to be jabbing into your back all night long. The biggest complaint I've heard about inflatable sleeping pads is that it can feel like you're sleeping on a bag of chips, or at least sound like it, because they tend to be more crinkly and noisy. I'm sure some inflatable sleeping pads are more noisy than others, but in general, they're going to make more noise when you're tossing and turning than a closed cell foam pad. When I selected my sleeping pad for the AT, I had read the warnings about if you're a side sleeper or a stomach sleeper, don't get a closed cell foam pad. But I mean, $10 to $15, it was kind of hard not to at least just try it out. And I really wanted to stick with it, but by the time I made it to New Jersey, I just was not sleeping well at night at all. I wanted to cry, and I may have actually cried some at night because my hips were so sore. And I'd try sleeping on one hip and flipping to the other, but it just wasn't cutting it anymore. And if you don't get good rest, then you can't expect to hike good miles during the day. So in New Jersey, I went to an REI and I decided I was going all in on a sleeping pad so that I could rest well at night. And I got the Thermarest Neo-Air X-Lite sleeping pad. And pretty much for the 6 to 7 years now since then, I have stuck with a Neo-Air X-Lite. I've dabbled in some different pads that were decent, but that's my go-to. It can be a little intimidating at first, worrying about your sleeping pad popping and leaving you hanging at night, but most of the sleeping pads that are inflatable come with a patch kit for field repair, and I've had to repair 2 of mine in the field, and the patch held for the rest of my thru hike, and those were Neo-Air X-Lites. Certainly all inflatable sleeping pads are not created equal, and of course you want to look at the weight of the pad, the cost of the pad, how long the pad is for your height. I actually go with a shorter pad now, just from my head to my knees, and I put my pack under my legs, but that would have made me nervous to do my first thru hike. You just eventually learn what you can do without. But another thing you want to think about is how high off the ground your sleeping pad is going to be, how thick the pad is. Because if you are a side sleeper and you're going to have those hips digging into the ground, If it's a thinner pad, then you still might feel the ground somewhat with your hips. If it's a thicker pad, then you've got a better shot at being more cushioned. But make sure whatever sleeping pad you end up with, whether that's a closed cell foam pad or an inflatable pad, that you have an R value of at least a 2. That's what's recommended for 3-season backpacking, and that's what you should experience on the AT, at least if you're in the typical time frame. If you are going to be out there a little bit early or a little bit later, depending on direction or just your availability to go hike the trail, then you might want to get a warmer sleeping pad than an R value of 2. If you've never heard of R value, that's basically the pad's ability to keep you insulated and warm at night. So the higher the number, the warmer the sleeping pad. And just for a rule of thumb, if you are going to be out there in the colder winter months, then it's recommended for winter backpacking you have an R value of 5. Just as a side note, I clearly did not know all of this information about gear when I was researching for my thru hike and even after I had begun my thru hike. So one method that I use that might also be helpful to you is I looked at gear lists from thru hikers of the past, and I figured if the gear they used worked for them, they didn't die, they successfully completed their thru hike, then it might also work for me, or at least it would be a good starting off point for my own research. If you think this method might work better for you, I've got 3 different gear lists in the video description. One being the gear that I actually carried with me on the AT. The second one being the gear list that if I was using a similar budget as what I did before, what I would carry now with me on the AT. And the third list is what I would carry with me now if I were to have an unlimited budget for the AT. I actually have a whole video that goes into these gear lists as far as what I actually carried with me on the trail and what I would carry now. So if you want to check that out, I'll put that link in the video description also. All right, y'all, well, that is all I have for you on today's topic. Next up, we'll be talking about footwear. So if you want to check that out, you can click right here. Or if you would like to see one big video that has all of this information split up with timestamps, you can check that out down here. Or if you would like to watch my thru hike of the Appalachian Trail, you can check that out down below. Thank y'all for watching, and we will see y'all next time.